G'day and welcome back to the channel. On this episode, we are working back on the Morris Minor and I'm going to show you how I've done the hydraulic clutch conversion. Alright folks, so as I said, on this episode I'm going to show you how to do the hydraulic clutch conversion. There is one other video out there on YouTube that I've seen and it wasn't overly informative. Yes, it does give a bit of insight into what the setup is, but the guy was literally all over the shop like this. So it was really hard to properly understand and see how I've got this thing set up. Sorry, how he had that thing set up. So in my case, I'm going to show you how to set it up on a Morris Minor. So as most of you know, it came out with a rod style system that went from the clutch pedal inside, a set of levers all the way over to the bell housing. Now what I've done here is at the moment it's currently charging the battery, so just excuse these wires. Yes, it does look like the wires are around the wrong way, but it's weird because out of the charger it goes red and black to black and red, which is really odd. Anyway, so here's what I've done. I've run a external master cylinder, so we've run a remote res. I've just made a bracket and I've mounted it just here as well in one of the holes that were already there for the battery support. I do need to do another battery support for this, but we can do that in a later episode. So run the hydraulic fluid pipes all the way down from here. So I run a couple of fittings. Now this is one that I bought from a specialized brake place. Essentially, I said to them, this is what I'm doing, this is what I need, can you get me something? And they just found something to suit, and that was it. There's a couple of different fittings there. I think they're aeroflow fittings, so they are fairly accessible. Now we just have a pipe running directly down from here all the way down to the clutch master cylinder. I'll show you that in just a sec. All right, so let's jump onto the car and let's have a look. Now the reason why we decided to do this was A, I just wanted to try something new, and B, it wasn't going to work with the style of setup that we originally ran, especially because we changed from a side valve engine all the way through to a overhead A-series engine. So here we are under the tunnel. Now you've got your cross member here that holds the gearbox, and that's all done up tight. You've got the tail shaft and you got your electric fuel pump as well. This is obviously aftermarket, just helps with overall startability, drivability, all that sort of stuff. Now, so here we have our clutch master cylinder. So what I've done is I've drilled a hole through this side and through to the other side of this. Now, what I've done is this pipe directly runs from the remote res all the way down to the feed line that goes inside the master cylinder. As you can see there is another steel line that's bent and comes back up and around, and that goes to the slave cylinder, which is just over here. Now this is a slave cylinder that we got off a Sprite, so you just need to make sure that the push rod length is the right length before you go any further, and that you have a return spring on it as well, so it needs to be able to pull back to where it needs to be. I'll talk about that in just a second. The setup that I'm running with this is I've got an adjustable clevis pin here with an extendable rod here. So this comes directly out of the clutch master cylinder, and I had to get this custom made in a particular length to make sure that it was going to work. As you can see here, so where my finger is, that's the lever for the clutch. So the clutch pedal works directly on here. So on the inside is where the clutch pedal moves. When you put your foot in the clutch, this rod then moves back, and you have an adjustment here. So depending how much throw you need, you can adjust it either further in or further out. Once it's then compressed, it then sends the fluid all the way up through the master cylinder, through this steel pipe, down around here. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the camera around. All the way down here. No, sorry, that's not it. It runs all the way up the top. Sorry, I was looking at the wrong line. I do need to put some P-clips on the side here just to hold this line and stop it moving around. It then runs to a flexible braided brake line. So this one here, and then it goes directly to the clutch slave cylinder. Now, when I bought the gearbox, he put the wrong selector fork in, which meant the only other option I could do is run a bolt and nut setup. So what I've done here is, it is pretty self-explanatory. I've run a 3/8 bolt all the way through. It's probably about 2 inches long, maybe 2.5, and I've put 2 nuts on the back of it. Now, what the 2 nuts do is it enables me to adjust the push rod length. So once again, you need to make sure that you have the right style setup and the right amount of free play in there. You don't want it to be too long or too short. Otherwise, when you go to put your foot on there, it's either going to overthrow it and damage something, or it's not going to engage it enough when you put your foot in the clutch. So it is a very, very basic setup, but this is how I did it, and it is quite simple to do. Because this is a right-hand drive vehicle, you don't have the exhaust coming down this side, you don't have anything on this side, whereas on the left-hand side, if you mount it on a left-hand drive vehicle, you'll find that it might mount a little bit easier. Maybe on the later models it might be a little bit easier to do, but also the exhaust runs on the outside, so you don't have any sort of heat or anything there, which is good by mounting that on the inside of the chassis. So that's pretty much it. Pretty straightforward setup. I did, as I said, have to make or get all these pipes made up. Essentially, I just told them the length, and then I just bent it into shape where I need it to be, and then just adjust the push rod length depending on how much throw you need. So what I've done is I've put 2 nuts between here. That'll just keep this clevis to this side and keep it nice and firm, and that way it's not going to move around, as well as put this nut on this side. That way it's nice and firm all the way through. That way there's no movement. Originally when I put it in, it would move up and down and it would have a lot of free play. So I've taken that free play out and now she's fine. But that's it, guys. That's how you do a hydraulic clutch conversion on a Morris Minor. All right, folks, before we go, there's something I need to discuss before we end the episode. This, as you can see, is a release fork and a bearing. This is the standard style bearing, and this is the mechanical style setup of the clutch. Now, take note of this bit here. It is arched. This is for a mechanical or cable style clutch setup. So although this will work with a longer push rod, which is exactly what we've got, it is not working with the application in which we're doing. I end up using a 6-inch long push rod to take out the adjustment from here. Where this sits inside the bell housing, it was actually limiting how much movement and throw we actually had on the diaphragm itself, which meant essentially once it was fully adjusted, we had about 10 mil, so probably half an inch between the end of the arm and the bell housing. So once I started to engage the clutch, it only had that much room to move, which was barely enough to properly engage the clutch. Now, it did take me quite some time, and I had a few mates come around and we sat down, we nutted it out. So thank you very much to those guys jumping on board and helping me out. Essentially what we came to the conclusion of is A, the clutch arm is wrong. So the hydraulic arm needs to be probably straighter, I would assume. Most importantly is what has caused all this drama is one particular component, and it's kind of snowballed to get to where we are today. So between the engine and the gearbox, there is a sandwich plate. As you guys saw in previous episodes or episodes coming out, we used a thicker sandwich plate. So let's just say the original thickness of the sandwich plate was 3 mil. We are now using a 10 to 12 mil thick piece of alloy or aluminium or aluminum, as you call it in the States, between the engine and the gearbox. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It gives definite extra strength to it, and is something that we really need to consider when you're doing this sort of thing because of the extra torsional twist and power we're putting through the engine. But what that actually does is it extends the length of the engine and gearbox assembly. Now, because it's extending it, it then means the repercussion is that the amount of throw you need on the clutch is significantly more, which means this arm either needs to be different or we do something else. And it wasn't until I ran into this issue and I noticed that we only had 10 mil between the end of the arm and the bell housing, but also that the release bearing wasn't engaging properly. So what I did was I contacted Colin from Sprite Parts, and he advised me that we need an offset release bearing as well as a correct arm. Now, as I said, the correct arm is either one of these. If you are running a hydraulic clutch, you do need a hydraulic clutch arm, but the mechanical or cable clutch arm will work just fine. Because we need the offset bearing, the correct arm, and we have the thickness of the new sandwich plate between the engine and gearbox, it's put us in this predicament. So the setup that we had is going to work. I had to pull the gearbox back out, which took me an hour to do, and it's not the end of the world. But also I had to machine down the edge of that sandwich plate as well, where the starter motor is. Once I had the car running and I got it tuned, I then got to a point where I realized that, hang on a minute, this is going to be touching, it's going to start wearing through the paint, it's going to cause vibrations, especially under driving, and torsional twist of the engine. So I had to pull it out, and there's now a good 5mm gap between the chassis of the vehicle and the sandwich plate. So take note that the hydraulic clutch setup that we did is going to work, but not with this setup. When you are modifying cars, these are the sort of things that you really need to be considerate of, is that when you change one thing, it generally can snowball into several things that do need to change. So moving forward from here, this is what we're doing. We are going to get a new release bearing that is offset, which will pull it out further, which then means it has less throw, which means we're able to actually actuate it with the correct amount of movement. So not only that, we're also going to be accompanying it with the correct arm. So likely one that's probably a bit straighter than this, I would imagine. Instead of it curving down, I'd say it probably goes fairly straight. That way it's on a different fulcrum point, and that way it can engage it properly. And we are making sure as well that everything is adjusted correctly. So because we're running the hydraulic clutch setup, there is adjustment in the clutch master cylinder, and there's also clutch adjustment in the clutch slave cylinder. So we do have 2 extra adjustments there, but you do need to make sure that you don't overthrow it, which then means you can overspring the diaphragm, which then you can damage the clutch assembly. So it's definitely not something that you need to be, super over vigilant with. You need to make sure that whatever you are doing, it is the right process for the vehicle. So just sort of talk about that before I moved on and said, hey, this is the setup that we're using, it actually works. So I'm going to put all this back together, and then we're going to be looking into this and confirming that it actually works, because this is really the only thing at the moment stopping me from driving the car. Hope you guys enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you right here on another episode of Tomo's Tune-Ups.